27 men are sometimes listed as the official death toll of the Brooklyn Bridge. Other records say 20. Nobody actually knows because the worst injuries didn't kill men on the spot, they killed them weeks later, from a disease doctors in 1870 didn't even have a name for yet. This is the bridge's foundation work. 2 airtight wooden boxes sunk to the bottom of the East River, 80 feet down, where candles burned blue and a wrong move getting back to the surface could kill you with 0 warning. 5 jobs made that possible. Here's how they stack up, starting with the one holding dynamite. Number 1. The Powder Man. Before diggers could move a single boulder wedged in the East River's bed, someone had to blow it apart with dynamite inside a sealed wooden box, lit by open candle flame, in an atmosphere pumped full of compressed air. The caissons themselves were enormous upside-down chambers, the Brooklyn one measuring 168 feet long by 102 feet wide, pressed into the riverbed while men worked in the sealed compartment underneath. The Powder Man packed his charges into the rock, cleared the chamber, and lit the fuse in a space with nowhere to run and no fresh air to clear the smoke afterward. A dynamite crew usually got one honest attempt to blast a boulder cleanly, because a second, closer blast in that same enclosed wooden room risked igniting timber that was already sitting in an oxygen-rich, pressurized environment. That alone should have ended a lot of careers early. But the detail that rarely makes the story is that this same crew was doing it dozens of feet beneath a live shipping channel, with thousands of tons of river water sitting directly overhead, held back by nothing but air pressure and a few feet of wood. Therefore, every blast was a calculated bet that the explosion wouldn't crack the one barrier keeping the East River out of the room. That's a job most people wouldn't take twice, but the job that follows it is the one that actually turned the bridge's chief engineer into an invalid. Number 2, the lock tender, and the disease nobody could name. Workers entered and exited the caisson through a small iron airlock, and this is where the job's real danger lived, because in the 1870s, nobody, not the sandhogs, not the foreman, not even the physicians, understood what compressed air was doing to the human body. Dr. Andrew Smith, the physician stationed at the site, documented 110 serious cases of what he was the first to call Caisson's disease by 1873, including several deaths. And workers started calling it the bends because of the stooped, twisted posture it left them in. Disputed. Sources differ on the total count. Some put deaths from the disease specifically in the low single digits by 1873, while overall construction fatalities are cited anywhere from 20 to 27, since 19th century record keeping on this kind of injury simply wasn't rigorous. But here's the counterintuitive part. Workers were paid by the trip, not the hour, which meant the men had a direct financial incentive to rush through the airlock and get back to the surface as fast as possible, the exact behavior that caused the disease in the first place. Washington Roebling himself, the bridge's chief engineer, was hit by a severe attack in 1872 after inspecting the Brooklyn Caisson, and it left him partially paralyzed, in pain, and eventually bedridden for most of the rest of construction. Therefore, the single most dangerous part of the job wasn't the digging, the dynamite, or the depth. It was the 90 seconds it took to go from one atmosphere to another, and nobody involved could see the danger coming until it had already happened to them. You'd think that was the worst part of a sandhog's day. It wasn't even the part they complained about most. Number 3, the sandhog. Once the powder crews cleared a section, the men called sandhogs moved in with picks and shovels to dig out the shattered rock and river mud by hand. Inside a chamber contemporary accounts describe as roughly 80 degrees, thick with foul, stagnant air, lit only by gaslight and candle flame. Immigrant laborers, many of them Irish, German, and Italian, made up most of these crews, earning around $2 a day, which was decent pay for unskilled labor in 1870, largely because so few men were willing to do the job at all. In May 1872, the sandhogs went on strike demanding $3 for a 4-hour shift instead of a full day underground, a demand the New York Bridge Company crushed within days simply by threatening to fire everyone who refused to go back down. But the physical toll went beyond heat and mud. Headaches, bloody noses, itchy skin, and a slowed heartbeat were considered a normal Tuesday in the Caisson, tolerable side effects of an 8-hour shift most men just worked through. Therefore, the job selected for something almost as specific as steady nerve under pressure, not strength alone, but a body that could function while quietly being poisoned by its own air supply. Digging through solid ground was hard enough, but the ground itself kept trying to kill them in a completely different way. Number 4. The Blowout Crew. The East River's bed wasn't flat or uniform, and that unevenness created one of the Caisson's strangest hazards, the blowout. If two corners of the Caisson's cutting edge rested on solid rock while the other two sat in soft mud, compressed air could suddenly find a weak point and rupture straight up through the riverbed. Sandhogs described these eruptions as looking like small underwater volcanoes, geysers of mud, water, and air punching through the river's surface without warning. A severe blowout could drop the internal pressure fast enough to put every man in the chamber at risk within seconds, and workers up on the surface, who had no idea what was happening below, would suddenly see the river itself seem to boil. The men whose job it was to manage the water shaft, the vertical passage used to haul out mud, debris, and displaced water, were often closest to these ruptures when they happened, with almost no time to react. But the genuinely unsettling part is that this danger was essentially unpredictable, because nobody working in 1870 had reliable instruments to map what kind of riverbed sat beneath any given section of the box. Therefore, on any given shift, the ground could simply decide the job was over, with no fault, no warning, and no way to have seen it coming. If the river didn't get you through mud or blowouts, there was still one more way the Caisson itself could turn on you. Number 5. The Timberman and the Fire Watch. The Caissons were built almost entirely from wood, sealed and pressurized, which meant that any open flame, and there were plenty, from candles to the powder crew's blasting work, sat inside what was functionally a giant airtight tinderbox. In December 1870, a candle ignited the timber ceiling of the Brooklyn Caisson, and the fire caught and smoldered in the wood for weeks, feeding on the same compressed air that was supposed to keep the river out. Washington Roebling spent a night personally searching the burning chamber trying to locate the blaze, and when conventional firefighting failed, he made the decision to deliberately flood part of the Caisson, accepting the real risk that flooding could collapse the whole structure, simply to smother a fire that couldn't be reached any other way. The men responsible for shoring up the timber roof and walls worked constantly against rot, pressure, and now fire, knowing that a structural failure 80 feet down wouldn't give anyone time to reach the airlock. But the gamble worked, and the Caisson survived. Therefore, the job of keeping a wooden pressure chamber from burning down around you, underwater, turned out to be just as essential and just as overlooked as the men doing the digging inside it. The bridge's designer, John Roebling, never even made it to this part of the story. In 1869, before a single caisson was sunk, a docking ferry crushed his foot during a site survey, and the tetanus that followed killed him 3 weeks later. His son Washington took over as chief engineer, sank both caissons, got paralyzed by the same disease his own workers were suffering, and finished directing the project from a bedroom window with a telescope, relaying every instruction through his wife, Emily Warren Roebling, who spent the next decade as the actual on-site engineer in everything but title. So the next time you walk across that bridge, you're not just crossing a 19th century engineering marvel. You're standing on top of 2 wooden boxes that dynamite men blew apart, sandhogs dug out by hand, lock tenders rushed through blind, blowout crews survived by luck, and a fire crew saved from burning down, built by a family that lost a father, crippled a son, and handed the whole project to a woman nobody had given the title to. That's the part of the Brooklyn Bridge nobody puts on a postcard.